Heavenly Father, I thank you again that you show grace to such sinners, that you are even aware of the ways that we don't even know how much we need you or how much we sin, and yet you still sent Christ to die and rise again. And so we are in awe of that kind of tender mercy and care for us and love. It's not just supernatural, it's just beyond anything we can conceive of. And so like children who don't understand all that their parents do, I think sometimes it's best just for us to come before you with that same humble and submissive attitude. And I pray that that would be rewarded with blessing, with greater faith, with the heart that is like yours, and with the attitude to serve like Christ did. So thank you again for this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, we are in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, and we are rounding out that famous chapter, the Hall of Faith. And we're getting to this finish line because this is the part where the writer of Hebrews just sort of rattles off a lot of things. In fact, he's going to start this section, chapter 11, verses 32 through 38, with, "What more shall I say?" In other words, time would fail me to tell you of, and he gives this list and rattles it off. It's sort of like when you have a paper. This never happened to me, by the way, but when you have a paper and you're realizing you're only halfway through your argument, but there's only like 300 words that you have left to use. And so you're that opposite situation where you have a lot more to say, but you have not a lot of time to say it. So I'll ask the writer of Hebrews when I see him, but what was he gonna say if he had more time? And so we'll elaborate on that in heaven and see how that goes. But we do have the opportunity, because we're in a context now, to explore some of these things, to share in them. But before we get into all of that, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think one of the key questions that at least I ask as we've gone through a whole chapter of what it means to live by faith, I think in some ways we've seen what the obstacles to living by faith are. And if I were to ask you, both in your, not just in terms of the text here and what we've seen in Abraham's life or Isaac's life or Jacob's life, what were the obstacles to faith? But if I were to ask you, what are some of the obstacles to you in your life of faith? What are the things or the excuses that you give for why you don't live the way that God would have you live? And I know that if I was being honest, as I was studying this, I realized these are the reasons that I have. I think the two biggest reasons that we have is reluctance and pride or ego. That a lot of the reasons we don't act by faith is, one, we just don't want to because it's a really big inconvenience. It messes with my comfort. It's just not really what I want to do. That I had some projects that I wanted to take care of this afternoon, and living by faith, it might interrupt that. And then secondly, just the fact that I think I know a better way. And so, yeah, I could do it your way, God, but I also have this really good plan too. And so how about I try out my plan first, and if that is awful and doesn't pan out, then we'll go back to living by faith. And I think that, at least for me, sums up a lot of times where I know the right thing to do. I know what God has promised and commanded, but my reluctance or my pride stands in the way of that. And I think that is in some ways the best way to sum up, at least in this verse 32 of Hebrews 11, the first four names that are described there. And let me read the verse for you. It's not a whole lot of meat to it. We'll fill it in with our knowledge of the Old Testament. But Hebrews 11, verse 32, "And what more shall I say?" And we remember we were just talking about Jericho and Rahab and the conquest of the Promised Land. "For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets." I'll just read the rest, even though we won't get to it. "Who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Now, this series is called Amazing Faith is Daily Faith, and the reason for that being is, again, the whole thesis of Hebrews 11 is that living by faith is not something that just those superheroes in the Old Testament did, but it's exactly the kind of faith that the writer of Hebrews is calling normal, everyday people like you and me to. And so here at the end of the Hall of Faith, you might say, where he rattles off a lot of names, he's really describing, in some ways, very ordinary people who found them, it's very, very cliche, but it's true, in very extraordinary circumstances. That they all had the same kind of faith that you and I could have. It just so happens that there was a time of crisis or someone needed to rise up, and these men and women did exactly that. So amazing faith really is just daily faith. And that brings us to this list of names in verse 32, and we'll only get through the first four. But there is a problem in doing this, is am I respecting the intention of the author who says, I don't have enough time to talk about these guys? If I take the time to talk about these guys, are you not getting the sense of the passage if I explain to some degree who these people are? Well, I think that we are respecting the intent of the writer by bringing up these men and a little bit about their life, if only because he sort of assumes, because his audience is a group of Jewish people, that they would be familiar with these people. Now, I know more than half of you here, and I can probably wager that most of you have heard of these names before, but I don't think I could assume it in exactly the same way that the writer of Hebrews could assume that they would be familiar. It would be, I think for me, or in our context, if I said, now time, would fail to tell, for me to tell you about Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, and you're like, oh yeah, I know, you don't need to rehearse their whole life stories for me. I get the idea. But for some of us, if I said Gideon, Samson, Jephthah, you might know two of those, maybe just one. And so I think it would be respectful of the intent of the writer of Hebrews, just to give you a sense. These men continue the story of faith in the Bible, and I'll leave you to explore the more in-depth stories on your own. The first thing I want to mention is that for whatever reason, well, not for whatever reason, but these names are not in chronological order. These first four names, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, they are names of judges, and we'll get to that, what that is and what that means in a second, but they're not paired, or they're not arranged chronologically. In other words, one judge would follow another, but this is almost not completely backward, but the real order would have been Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. So it's pretty twisted around. So we'll get to why that is in a second, and then we won't get to David and Samuel next, but David's like the first real king of Israel, so his name gets prominence even over Samuel. So I think first, we need to catch up on the history. After all, we left in our study, you might say, an overview of the Old Testament with Jericho and Rahab. Now, after Jericho was reduced to rubble, and after they rescued Rahab, the prostitute, the Israelites, they mostly conquered the Promised Land with Joshua, if you remember, in command of the Israelites. He was given that mantle of responsibility by Moses, who was not allowed to enter the Promised Land. And so the book of Joshua, which follows Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua follows, and a lot of the book of Joshua, if you read it, is inheritance and land, and this tribe got this plot of land over here. There's a lot of names, a lot of territories, and it's important because it seems like by the end of Joshua, they've done it. The Abrahamic covenant seems to be within their grasp. And remember, in some ways, this hall of faith is we are tracking the Abrahamic covenant, that promise that God made to Abraham. You will have a great nation come from you. Your descendants will occupy this special land, and they'll be a holy nation, and they will be a blessing to the world. And it seems like there were so many threats to that. By the end of Joshua, you get the feeling, maybe, just maybe, we've done it. We've arrived. They're in the land. Most of their enemies have been conquered, and there's a lot of discussion, we won't get into it, about whether they completely conquered the land or did not completely conquer the land, because there's some phrases where it says that Joshua wiped out all the living beasts in the land. And so you have phrases like that, but I think we know by implication of what happens that it was not a complete conquest. At the very least, the most important thing had not been conquered in the land of Israel, which was the Israelites, their hearts. So you could say what you want about them almost getting the land, but faith is lacking still, even though it seems like on the surface of it that Abrahamic covenant is happening. It's happening before our very eyes. And this is actually what Joshua says in his last address to the Hebrews. If you turn to Joshua, the very last chapter, in chapter 24, this is his farewell address, and a part of it is very familiar to you. But this is Joshua's words in Joshua 24. First, he gathers everyone up together, and then he talks about the Abrahamic covenant and how God had promised to Abraham this land and would give it as a possession to Isaac and to Jacob. And then he talks about the Exodus, which now at this point very few of them would remember. If you recall, a whole generation, the generation that came out 20 and older, they perished in the wilderness. And so very few, or not all of them, would understand these references to what life was like under Egypt, but he references that. And then he talks about their fighting in Jericho and how all of the people, picking up in verse 11, the leaders of Jericho fought against you, also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. I gave them into your hand. These were all the nations that were in and surrounding the promised land, and they were driven out before them. And I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you, the two kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. So, again, seems really good. Now, therefore, fear Yahweh and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve Yahweh, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. Very famous passage. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua is saying this, and when you think about it in the context, there's already an implication that you guys are going to do you. But whatever you do, me and my house, we're going to honor the Lord. Well, what's that saying by implication? Is everything right in everyone else's house? He continues. Then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake Yahweh to serve other gods. For it is Yahweh our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And Yahweh drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve Yahweh, for he is our God. And they picked up on what Joshua was saying there, the subtle accusation. No, your God is our God too. We want to serve him also. But then Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve Yahweh, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake Yahweh and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. That's a stunning accusation, because it seems like at first Joshua's a little reserved from making any outright accusations against them. And just choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Oh, but we will. We will. Your God is my God too. And then he out and out calls them on, no, you won't. And this part doesn't get as much play in sermons because everyone wants to believe that they're Joshua and not the Israelites. But he is telling them that they cannot. Why? It seems like a very inflammatory kind of accusation. The people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve Yahweh. Believe me. Trust me. We will. Then Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen Yahweh to serve him. They said, we are witnesses. He said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your heart to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Do you see what's happening? They already have idols in their house, and they are saying, your God is my God. Our house will serve your God too, Joshua. What are you talking about? You're insulting me. And Joshua has to come to the point and say, do you even get it? You literally have these idols already in your house. You conquered the land of these people by the hand of the God who rescued you out of Egypt, and then you took their idols of the gods you just defeated, and now you're worshiping them. It's highly offensive. Joshua was upset, if you don't get the tone here, and very condemnatory, because this is the double-mindedness of this people. That they, who have by the might of God, have conquered these other nations and their foreign gods. And remember, if you beat another nation, your God was beating their God. And so for them to take the idols of those people groups who were pagans, idolaters, who were soundly defeated by the Israelites and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to take those and just bring them back into your house to worship, absolutely offensive. And Joshua calls them out and says, you're witnesses against yourselves then. So be it. The book of Judges follows, and it's really just a continuation of this duplicity, of this hypocrisy. The book of Judges exists because despite God keeping his promises, the people had sinful natures that could not worship God. Despite having conquered the land, their own sinful hearts had not been conquered. And there's a cycle in the book of Judges that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The Israelites, they will fall into deep sin. I mean, they've already got the idols in their house. Even when Joshua is saying, serve the Lord, serve him alone. Yes, we'll do that. Well, you should be running home, destroying those, and then coming back and saying, okay, we will serve God. So they fall into this deep sin. They do whatever's right in their own eyes, a common refrain, or they do great evil in the eyes of God. Those phrases keep coming up. And then a foreign nation or power would come and oppress them. Some of the reason being that they did not make a total destruction necessarily of the lands that surround them. And both because sin makes you easy prey. When you're in the midst of sin, you're just easy prey for all sorts of temptations, all sorts of evil powers to come upon you and abuse you. These other nations would come and prey upon the people. Simultaneously, this was a judgment of God. He was using these nations to judge the Israelites. Now, once it got bad enough, of course, the people would cry out to God. They cry mom, they cry dad. And he would send a judge to rescue and deliver the people. And then there would be some period of peace and prosperity. And then what would happen? It all just go back in. They get spiritually dull in their prosperity, and they once again fall into sin. And then you have the cycle over and over again for hundreds of years. And so these judges were actually generals and judges, or warriors and judges. So, for example, in Judges 3, 7 through 15, you get a flavor of this. This is the first judge, Othniel. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. They forgot Yahweh their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. Those are idols. Therefore, the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to Yahweh, Yahweh raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of Yahweh was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and Yahweh gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and so on and so on. So you get a little flavor for the dynamic. This is the engine that runs the book of Judges. This is the engine, frankly, that unfortunately runs a lot of people's lives. Is they have this short-term, things get really bad, they'll cry out to God for a moment, and then things will get better. And then as soon as things are better, they abandon God, they stop going to church, whatever, and they get back into sin. And then when it gets bad enough, someone from church invites them, and they come, and then they feel better, and the cycle goes over and over again. So this is just, it's very typical sort of dynamic here. And so we go from Othniel to Ehud and Shamgar. And then we get finally to Barak, which is second in the pair, but first chronologically. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. So Barak comes before Gideon chronologically, and Jephthah comes before Samson. So if you take them as pairs, Gideon and Barak go together, but Gideon gets kind of a preeminent place in the pairing, maybe because he's got a more interesting story. But Barak comes first, so we'll take it chronologically and not the order that is in the book of Hebrews. Now, in your Bibles, it probably says Deborah and Barak, and that is because Deborah was actually the judge figure, and Barak was the general figure, the warrior figure. In this case, most commentators make the comment that it was unusual for a woman to sit as a ruler in Israel, and so there's sort of an assumption that there was a lack of male leadership at this time, and you can certainly see that in Barak's life too. And this is nothing against, of course, women. There's many prominent figures in the Bible who are women. They're prophetesses. There's many women of great faith, have other significant roles, but just in general at that time, any nation is mostly men, or almost only men, that ruled. And so to have a woman ruling was insinuating that there was a lack of male leadership. And you see that again in Barak. He's a very reluctant hero. He essentially refuses to be a general unless Deborah goes out into the battlefield with him. Not to fight, but just to go with him. And so she's the one that says in verse 6 of chapter 4, "Has not Yahweh, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun." In other words, it doesn't say where God said this to Barak, but the assumption is, because she's quoting the Lord, saying, God told you to do something, and Barak had not done it yet. He's a little bit insolent or reluctant to obey. So Deborah is there to say, hey, do you remember that? You are in disobedience to the Lord. And Barak's response is, in verse 8, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." So there's a little bit of a judgment for him being so reluctant to go. And as it turns out, the one that, when they go into battle against this King Sisera, it just so happens the one who kills Sisera is Jael, the wife of Heber. She drives a tent peg through his temple while he's asleep. It's a very brutal story, actually. But it's the king falls at the hands of a woman as well. And part of that is sort of a judgment on Barak's reluctance to do what God had clearly commanded him to do. And I should note that Deborah doesn't do any fighting or fight for Barak. She's not like a radical feminist by any stretch of the imagination. she acknowledges, actually perfectly well, the role that Barak had been given by God. She doesn't try to substitute or supplant that. She, in fact, just encourages him to fulfill that role, reminds him with what God had commanded him to do, and supported him and came along so that he would go and do it. So we call that relationship a complementary relationship, not a compliment like you look nice today, but a compliment as in like a perfect pairing. So it's very complementary. She doesn't try to supersede Barak's authority or supplant him. She had a God-given role. She did it. She helped Barak fulfill his God-given role. So it's actually a very beautiful picture there. But the main takeaway from the story is Barak seems very reluctant to obey the Lord. Now we'll kind of wrap up some observations at the end of this. But in a way, when you first read the story, you don't see some great act of faith by Barak. You see Deborah being actually very faithful. Now, the story of Gideon is probably more familiar, or at least more memorable. Gideon was called to fight the Midianites, so it kind of rhymes. Gideon, Midian. And he also had another name called Jerubbaal. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he has another name, Jerubbaal, that is. And it's because of something he did in breaking down an altar of Baal. Now, once again, Gideon is also somewhat of a reluctant hero. When he is called by the Lord, he gives somewhat of an excuse. It's very similar to Moses. You look at Judges 6 in verse 12. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, Yahweh is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, Please, my Lord, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recount to us, saying, Did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? But now Yahweh has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. And Yahweh turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do I not send you? And he said to him, Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And Yahweh said to him, But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. And he said to him, If now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you. And he said, I will stay till you return. So again, he is reluctant because of his stature. He's almost accusing God of, why is this even happening? And so he seems a very reluctant hero, and he is like the God tester. He has an audacity, I don't know that many have in the Bible. Abraham maybe comes close when he's pleading for the lives of those in Sodom and Gomorrah. If you remember, it's like if there's, 50 righteous, and he keeps pleading with the Lord. But this is a little bit different in that he's blatantly testing God. And Gideon is a God tester. He asks for signs numerous times. If you remember the fleece, the laying out of fleece, have you ever heard of that phrase, laying out a fleece? And I think we tend to think of that as like a positive way of, and this is in verses 36 through 40, but basically, if you're going to really use me to save the Israelites, then I'm going to lay out this piece of fleece, and if the fleece is wet in the morning, but everywhere around it is dry, then I know you are going to do this. Well, God does it, and then the next day, says, okay, just one more time, but this time the fleece will be dry and the ground will be wet. Now, I think that some people have this as a decision-making strategy, this idea of laying out a fleece, but understand, this was faithlessness. He was doing this out of reluctance and faithlessness to trust the Lord. It's not a paradigm for us to adopt. It's just like when he tests him here. God is speaking to him. There's no doubt about it. He knows it too, and yet he has a little bit of that audaciousness to numerous times question God in choosing him. It's like, Gideon, God is talking to you and telling you what to do. You know it. Why isn't that enough? And of course, it comes off as rather faithless. He also has that famous incident, another faith-testing moment, at least for him, of when he was supposed to go against a force of over 100,000, and he already begins with just 22,000 people, and God says, nope, that's too many, right? If you remember that in chapter 7, nope, that's too many. And he whittles down Gideon's fighting force to 300 men against well over 100,000. And then the battle strategy, if you recall, is very obscure. It has to do with trumpets again, sort of like Jericho, and and torches. So they don't even fight. It's not even that he needs the 300 men, frankly, because God causes the people to be in almost like a stupor where they're fighting each other. It doesn't even need 300 men. So we tend to remember that story as well, and that is, frankly, again, God trying to demonstrate, you realize, Gideon, it has very little to do with your strength. I'm fighting these battles, not you. You keep testing me as if it's dependent on you, but it's not. Now, to be fair, his life seems to end on a much happier note, or positive note. When he dies, he dies as a hero. He seems to be more trusting of the Lord. But then you read this at the end of chapter 8. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, remember Jerubbaal was his nickname, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. So Gideon, despite all of his successes, relatively speaking, had a more interesting life than Barak, which is why maybe his name comes first in the list, Gideon and Barak. Yet he had 71 sons, 70 plus Abimelech, and that one son, Abimelech, ended up killing all 70 of his brothers, except for one. So, again, the cycle is good times only last so long. The sin that's in their heart is refreshed with every generation. Now, what unites Gideon and Barak, if they are indeed a pair in Hebrews 11, is, I think, their reluctance. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning. But at the least, by faith, they were willing to overcome their reluctance. One by the encouragement of another, Barak, being encouraged by Deborah, and the other by God's patient enduring and testing of the testing, Gideon. Let me think of it another way, or let's think of this another way. Barak was much easier to persuade to do the right thing. In some ways, I think he's a better figure than Gideon, even though Gideon has a lot more written about him and seems like a much more interesting story. Yet Barak, at least for his part, all he needed was some encouragement. Didn't God say this? Yeah, I did. I'll go if you go. Okay, I'll go. All right. And he goes and he defeats the enemies of God. Gideon, on the other hand, he tested God multiple times, he kind of accused God, and he still even then seemed reluctant. And so God may have used him more mightily or accomplished more through Gideon, but if I was going to judge hearts, I think Barak might have had a little bit more willingness to serve the Lord. Now, both of these men are being used as examples of faith. Well, in what way? And maybe we can talk about some practical applications, or at least some thoughts here. Can faith and reluctance coexist? Can faith and reluctance coexist? Well, yes and no. I mean, there's plenty of times where I have done what I was called to do as a man of God, but there was a little bit of dragging my feet. Did I get it done ultimately? Yes, I did, but was my heart exactly right? Not necessarily. But if Hebrews 11 is willing to call these men, Gideon and Barak, who both demonstrated some reluctance, men of faith, that's sort of hopeful. That God is, He understands our frailty. He understands our weakness, and He understands our reluctance. The bottom line is that both men ultimately did what the Lord commanded. They did. They exercised faith and pushed past that reluctance or doubt and took that tiny bit of step of obedience, even if it was small, even if it was, I'll go if you go, but they did it. They did it, and God was sovereignly coming alongside to support them. I know that there are times for us when faith isn't about knowing what God has promised. We know what God has promised. We've made a big deal about that in Hebrews 11, is when God says it, it's going to happen, it's going to be sure. There's a lot of times where I think we know. We know. Just like Barak knew he was told to go fight, sister. Just like Gideon knew that God was telling him he's going to be the deliverer for Midian. I think there's a lot of time where we know what God has called us to do, what He's promised to do. But living it out is a little bit hard. There's so many scriptures, actually, they're so plain and obvious in their application that even the most stone cold of unbelievers would not misunderstand. In 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, does not boast. You don't need to be some great theologian to understand that, but sometimes it's hard to actually live that out, to choose it. And Gideon questioning the Lord, even though the Lord had clearly spoke to him, it's lamentable, but it's also relatable. Just like there's so many passages of scriptures we know, and yet we have a little bit of reluctance. And so I think one of the applications of this is actually when we hit that wall of reluctance sometimes, we should be very thankful when we have a faithful sister or brother who will encourage us to do what's right in God's eyes. It is, not just may very well, but it is God's means of helping our faith. And our walk in faith is for someone to come out with us on the battlefield, if only to shout out, go and do it. So we should be thankful for that. And let's also consider how there might be plenty of souls around us at church who just need that voice of encouragement also. That little extra, God is calling you to do this. Go and obey it. You know what? I'll go out with you. It's not unfaithful, in other words, to need a little push out the door sometimes. And I think there's a great blessing in being someone else's Deborah. So let's consider that. We can understand that when Gideon tested God, it was an expression of his reluctance to obey, not any question that he didn't understand what God had spoken. And so let's also consider if our reluctance is not just coming from a place where we need a little push out the door, let's examine ourselves when we are reluctant in our faith to consider, probably not, do I understand what God's command is for me? Because it's probably crystal clear what you need to do. In most situations, I think it's probably very clear what you need to do. I think our reluctance comes in that case, and in Gideon's case, in calculating the cost of that obedience. What might it cost me to obey? And so we get reluctant. Could taking a stand of faith cost me my job? If I tell the truth, could it hurt my relationship with this person? If I help this person out, is it going to throw off my schedule and my plans for the weekend? If I loan my car out to this family that could really use it, what happens if that person gets in an accident? I don't know if I want to be on the hook for that. I think most of the time, we know what we should be doing, and we only test God, like Gideon did, because we're trying to stall, or hopefully find some loophole out of doing it. And if that's the reason for our reluctance and not just needing that extra encouragement, which is fine, I think then it's helpful to remember Jesus' own words, that the cost of being a disciple is to deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow Him. But at the same time, it's not that Gideon just needed to be self-driven, self-motivated, like a pep room locker talk, so to speak, but rather embrace this paradoxical promise that Jesus himself lives on, which is Hebrews 12:2, which we'll get to not too long from now. Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. In other words, that's suggesting that the payoff for obedience should always offset our reluctance. What Gideon needed to think of is, if I obey the Lord right now, we'll be free of the Midianites. I'll have the blessing of having served my brothers and sisters. I'll have had the blessing of serving my God, and I'll see his wonders firsthand, rather than thinking, oh, what's this going to cost me? God's going to ask me to do a lot of uncomfortable things, and I don't know, this is going to mess up my schedule. I just wanted a quiet life, be a farmer, whatever. Instead of thinking of those things, to think of the joy, the many joys there is in obedience. And so whether one way or the other, our reluctance in our faith coming from just needing a little encouragement or frankly just needing to really rightly calculate the cost, I think we can say that as Christians, we will be reluctant in our faith, but you can still be faithful. God is a means for us to be faithful and to consider the example of Gideon and Barak and see in those stories how we might be able to overcome our reluctance, whether by being a Deborah or finding a Deborah that will encourage us, or by really considering the cost, not just in terms of me, but in terms of other people and in terms of the Lord. So, the second pair of judges, now we have Jephthah and Samson. And again, in Hebrews 11, it goes Samson and then Jephthah. And it might be because, again, Samson has a little bit more interesting story. It's more prominent or well-known, so his name gets put in front, and Jephthah not as much. But we'll go at it again chronologically with Jephthah first. And Judges 11 begins that story after all the stuff with Gideon's kid and the chaos that ensues after he murders all his brothers. You have Jephthah. Verse 1 of chapter 11. Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah. And Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob, and worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. So Jephthah is being painted in a very negative picture. On the one hand, you feel sorry for him because he gets picked on by his brothers for being the son of a prostitute. There's nothing he could do about that, right? It's not his fault that his mother is a prostitute. And yet, when he fled, he kind of collected worthless fellows around him. So you get the idea, like bad people attract bad people. So you get the idea that maybe he just had a chip on his shoulder and he carried that around, and other people gravitated towards him. And yet, this was the man that God chose to deliver them from the Ammonites, is this man Jephthah. As he gets older, and as you might imagine, being a mighty warrior with a chip on his shoulder, being the son of a prostitute, he was a proud fellow. And we see this mostly in what he is known for, which is his tragic vow, is the way the ESV calls it. Now, just so you know, verse 29, chapter 11, it says that the Spirit of Yahweh was upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and so on to get to the Ammonites. And the way that the Holy Spirit worked in the Old Testament typically was that it came upon individuals to empower them to do specific works. So it would come and it would go. Whereas in the New Testament, one of the amazing things about the New Covenant is that when a Christian receives the Holy Spirit, it doesn't just come and go. You can't lose it. It is deposited there and regenerating us from the inside out. So the operation of the Spirit of the Lord is a little bit different in the Old Testament than the New. And one of those things that make this passage interesting is that one of the first things that happens here when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah is he makes this vow. to the Lord. In verse 30, he says, "And Jephthah made a vow to Yahweh and said, 'If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be Yahweh's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering.'" So this is a big contrast to reluctant Gideon or reluctant Barak. He is saying, I'm making a promise here that if I come back to my house in victory, whatever comes out of my house is yours. Burnt offering. It's almost like, again, his pride is being sort of revealed here, that in his mind, he wants to be a bold, mighty warrior. Now, unfortunately, he makes this vow in arrogance. And you have to understand, in that culture, did they have animals in the house? Yes. Did they keep livestock and other animals in the house? Yes. But what do you expect is going to come out of your house 9 times out of 10 if you have kids and you're coming home? So I think we'd be pretty generous to say he was just assuming that some goat or something was going to come out of his house. I think we're meant to understand that this is a stupid and proud and arrogant and foolish vow to make. Because in fact, what comes out of his house is his daughter. And as soon as verse 34, then Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah. This is after he destroys the Ammonites. And behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me. For I've opened my mouth to Yahweh, and I cannot take back my vow." Now, to be honest, that whole sentence is dripping still with his pride. Now, for one thing, to say that you've brought me low means what? That he's very high, that he was proud and arrogant. And then to say that because he has made a vow to the Lord that he cannot take it back, well, he vowed something that was foolish and arrogant. And frankly, does the Lord want child sacrifices? Absolutely not. God condemns pagan nations for their child sacrifices. So, does he have to do something, commit one sin by, if you're going to commit one of these sins, we sort of talked about this last week, you have an option. You either commit the sin of not keeping your vow to God, or you commit the sin of doing something God hates. And it sounds like here that he was willing to offer his own child. Now, there's a certain desire by theologians to prevent the idea that Jephthah would sacrifice his own child. And I think this is valid. A lot of theologians take it as the possibility that his daughter was basically set apart in the service of God, never to marry or have kids, which would have effectively, since it's his only child, would have ended his line. So that Jephthah was eventually sacrificing his whole family tree, right? Because if his daughter doesn't have any kids, that's it. And so that's the sacrifice he ends up making. Because to be fair, it doesn't say explicitly that she was burnt in a fire. It says in verse 39, at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. And so it says according to the vow he had made, but again, it could be more that he offered her as a sacrifice, wholly devoted to the Lord, never to be kind of seen of or heard it from again outside of serving the Lord in earnestness. I don't know. I hope he didn't do that. It would just been another indicator of his tremendous pride, I think, if he would have allowed that to happen. But we don't know. It's mysterious. And again, you look at Jephthah and you're thinking, this doesn't sound like a tremendously faithful person to be lauding in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. But when you get to what happens after is that Jephthah does continue to be a judge. He continues to serve at the Lord's behest, and we'll come back actually to Judges 12 and what happens there to sort of wrap up the story with Samson. But there is indication, I think, there that, yes, he learned his lesson. Moving on to Samson. Samson, if Jephthah was proud and arrogant, Samson was 100 times more so. And again, maybe that's why his name comes first in Hebrews 11, because he has such a much more epic story of his failure and humility. And we won't go through it, but he was also a mighty warrior. His fatal flaw was women. He falls in love with Delilah, who discovers that the secret of his mighty strength is his hair, which was the symbol of his Nazirite vow. The Nazirite had 3 special restrictions. He used to not drink any wine or beer, any fermented drink, or eat even grapes or raisins. He could not have his hair cut during the time of that vow, which you could take a Nazirite vow for a short time, but his was lifelong. And lastly, he could not come near a corpse. Now, all of those, if you look into the details of the story, that all figures into this. Into the life of Samson. But for his pride, as you know, Samson, after defeating many Philistines, he finds himself caught by the Philistines because his hair is cut and his power leaves him, and he's chained in the halls of the Philistines, hanging up, humiliated. His eyes have been gouged out, and he is there as a spectacle, as a clown for the entertainment of the Philistines. Well, there he cried out to God one last time in Judges 16, 28 through 30. He says, Samson called to Yahweh and said, "O Lord Yahweh, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength. The house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Now, it's interesting that even in that last prayer and act of judgment, you still get that sense of pride, for my 2 eyes. That still bothers me. So give me strength to avenge my 2 eyes. Now, I hope you see some of the parallels to him and Jephthah. Both stories involve some kind of sacrifice. In Jephthah's case, it's his daughter and his whole lineage after him, because again, as his only child, he's basically not going to have any descendants. And Samson, of course, his own life. There's a rashness to both men. There's certainly an arrogance. Neither is really a super admirable character when you think about it. But even in their pride, one thing that they did have going for them, at least by the end of their lives, was that both men acknowledged that their strength came from God. Go back to Judges 12. Remember that I was mentioning earlier that Jephthah seemed to indicate that he understood a little bit better now than before where his strength came from. And he says in Judges 12:3, the Ephraimites were relatives, so they basically get into a civil war. Let's start in verse 2. Jephthah said to them, "I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And when I saw that you would not save me, I took my life in my hand and crossed over against the Ammonites, and Yahweh gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me?" Notice how he says that I took my life in my own hand, but who is the one that delivered the people into his hand? It was the Lord that did it. He was acknowledging there that his victories, he just put his life on the line. He put it out there, but it would have to be the Lord who would win the victory. And even if he was willing to go into battle as this mighty warrior, and you have to think as a mighty warrior and a proud warrior, for him to say, but victory only comes from God, it's a pretty humble statement to make. And with these men, you take what you can get as far as humility is concerned. Samson, too, for that matter, when he stood between those 2 pillars, He knew where his true strength came from. Did he at that point think, if only I had my hair, I could knock these pillars down? No. Who does he cry out to? He cries out to God, because he knows that was actually the source of his power. It was God who gave him strength up until that moment, and it was his faithlessness that stripped him of his powers, not the lack of hair. I know I pointed out the thing about his eyes, but I don't know, if you've ever met really proud people, you're just always thankful anytime they can have any sort of insight into their own lives and think outside of themselves. And for Samson's part, this was a humble thing to say at the end of the day. Please remember me. Please strengthen me, only this one, oh God. Even if he had to include his eyes and how he's still upset about that he had no strength apart from the Lord's empowerment. And for these accomplishments and acknowledgments, really, these two proud men, they warrant being in the hall of faith. Now again, that says something. You had two reluctant judges with Gideon and Barak, and here you have two men who are just very proud people at heart in the hall of faith. I think it's helpful to think, at least for all of us who are proud people at heart, like me, that God can still use me, even in my pride. But you see here the self-destructive nature of when people, proud people, try to serve the Lord. So often it makes them overconfident. Start to think that I'm the one that makes things happen. I'm the one that the church rides and falls on. I'm the one that's carrying this team. For the proud, we are most faithful, not when we stop doing wonderful or impressive things for the Lord, but when we can say, not I, but Christ in me. See, the point here isn't that these men should have stopped doing amazing, incredible feats of mighty warriorness. It's not that they needed to stop because there were bad guys that needed to be defeated. It's not that they should have stopped doing that. And so even here at the death of Samson, he still took out a lot of Philistines. It's not that we need to stop doing incredible things if you're someone that just happens to be a mighty warrior. It's that you would acknowledge that God is the one who empowers you. You don't need to stop being ambitious. You don't need to stop being zealous. That's not what humility is. You know, I'm not going to do anything amazing for the Lord because I'm so humble. I'm just going to toil away. But if you have talents and opportunities and giftings, God is saying, do them. But remember that you can do nothing apart from Christ. Right? Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. The point of that is not to empower you to, rob banks or become, Instagram model or something. It's to show you that when you do anything good, it's God who gets the glory because God gave you strength. What's common with all four of these men? Well, they're all just ordinary men. They're just people doing very people things, reluctant to obey, proud and flawed in just the same ways that we are, and yet God used them to defeat overwhelming odds, despite their reluctance, despite their pride. That God is calling us to do wonderful and mighty things, but to acknowledge that our strength comes from the Lord. That the Lord is willing to be patient with us when we're reluctant, but we do need to count the cost and see, this really would be helpful to others. Or maybe to look out for our brothers and sisters and say, maybe I need to give an encouragement that they might know and serve the Lord, because we could all use some encouragement to be faithful. That's okay. It's a really personal kind of thing when we read these stories, because on the surface of it, it does just seem like these are really awful kind of people that I don't want my kids to be like Samson. And yet I want them to know the God of Samson. I want them to be able to say, like Samson did, remember me and strengthen me, Lord. And so there's a lot more we could say. Again, like the writer of Hebrews, I'll say time doesn't permit for me to say all that we could say about the faith of these men, but at least maybe we can see some of these themes of faith, that it's not that God only uses perfect people. The kind of faith these men had was very ordinary, just like you, just like me. And so we are called to a daily faith, not an extraordinary faith, but one that is willing to overcome reluctance and pride. Heavenly Father, I do thank you that you are so patient with me. I think I tick a lot of these boxes as far as reluctance and pride goes, excuse making, dragging my feet. And I do thank you for the many brothers and sisters who've been there to encourage and correct and rebuke. I thank you, Lord, that in this body here we have so many people who are so committed to each other and love each other enough to encourage and to call out pride. I ask, Lord, that we would consider that to have faith is not something that only a few select do, but rather that if you are able to use Samson, you're certainly able to use us. So thank you, Lord, for your